Hi all. When Alex asked me to moderate it, I didn't realize it's this whole room that I'm going to be talking to. I thought it's one of those tiny little rooms. But we have a very interesting panel here, and the first person I would like to invite is Mariano Castro Jimenez, who works at the Secretariat on the Convention of Biological Diversity, where he leads the Peace and Biodiversity Dialogue Initiative. He's an environmental lawyer by education, and Mr. Jimenez has worked on multilateral environmental agreements, transboundary wildlife management, and peace and biodiversity, and will talk to us about HWCC from a policy perspective, particularly its place in the newly adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Please come. Thank you.
Hola, thank you very much, and I would like to thank the audience and also the organizers for inviting me, and because everything has been great, amazing so far. I would like to begin by sharing a short anecdote with you. So recently, a friend of mine posted on social media some photos of his recently acquired sheep. As you can imagine, for a Costa Rican, it's not very usual to have sheep. We live in a tropical country. Nevertheless, he posted more and more photos on social media. You can imagine these photos, right? Selfie with a sheep, cool reel with music and the sheep, no filter sheep. Nevertheless, I saw my friend some weeks ago, and I was trying to tease him and ask him, like, hey, are you gonna quit your current job and dedicate yourself to be a shepherd or raise sheep? And he looked at me super disappointed, and he said, well, you know what? At some point I really thought so. But a puma came in and he took one of my sheep, and then came back again and took another one, and then another one. And before things got really bad, I decided to sell them all. And the reason why I'm sharing this story with you, it's not because I want you to feel sorry for my friend. It's because I'm sure that you all can think about similar stories on different contexts, from different countries, and you can analyze them from all the disciplines that we have here. And yeah, regardless of all the different characteristics, I think that we can agree on a couple of things. This is a very complex challenge, and this is also a global challenge. And because this is a global challenge, we require a global policy response. And precisely, this is what I want to talk to you about today. So my presentation will begin by explaining what the Convention on Biological Diversity is. Then I will go through the work that the Convention has done on sustainable wildlife management, the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020 with its 20 Aichi targets, then the recently adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and why this means a paradigm shift for human-wildlife conflict and coexistence from a policy perspective. And then the big question, what happens next? So let's begin. The Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, was adopted in 1993. It's got 196 parties and 3 main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. The Convention's got 42 articles and 2 annexes with compromises made by the parties to fulfill these objectives. Specifically, Article 8 provides that each contracting party shall regulate or manage biological resources within or outside protected areas. It also provides for the protection of ecosystem, natural habitats, maintenance of viable populations of species in natural surroundings, provides for the necessary conditions of compatibility between present uses and the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of its components. It also talks about respect for innovation and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities, and to develop the necessary legislation to protect endangered or threatened species. Sorry. So in addition to this, Article 10 that refers to the use of components of biological diversity also provides that parties shall integrate into their national decision-making the issue of sustainable development, shall adopt the necessary measures to avoid or minimize the adverse impact on biological diversity, and to protect and encourage the customary use of biological resources. As we can see, the CBD provides a legally binding framework in which contracting parties commit as far as possible to integrate into their internal regulations a series of measures that aim to fulfill the objectives that I discussed before. But besides the obligations contained in the text of the articles, parties have also adopted programs of work and decisions. And these are adopted during COP. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. If you're not, COP is the Conference of the Parties, and it's actually the main governing body of the CBD. In the specific case of the CBD, COP happens every 2 years, and the most recent one just happened last December. So in these decisions, for instance, we have decision 917, in which this dates from 2008, in which COP encouraged parties to enhance sustainable wildlife management through land use planning to minimize human-wildlife conflict and achieve the sustainable use of wildlife. It is also important to mention that different programs of work have also included sustainable wildlife management. For example, the program of work on dried and subhumid lands. Another example is the adoption of voluntary guidance for sustainable wild meat sector. This was adopted in 2018, and it's decision 14.7. Here, I would also really like to highlight the importance of partnerships to deliver the objectives of the convention. And I will use as an example the collaborative partnership on sustainable wildlife management. Here it is. So the partnership is made out of 14 organizations. They all have a mandate concerning sustainable wildlife management. The partnership is also voluntary, which is something very important. And what it aims is to promote and increase cooperation and coordination to contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, food security, livelihoods, and well-being. As a way to move from text to action, the Convention adopted the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020, including the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. You might be familiar with the Aichi targets. This was an overarching framework applicable for not only for biodiversity-related conventions, but for the whole UN system and for partners working in biodiversity management and biodiversity policy as well. And something very important is that parties here agreed to translate this framework into a revised and updated national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Even though human-wildlife conflict and coexistence was not directly addressed within the Aichi targets, there are some specific targets that are important for this topic. For example, Strategic Goal C that aim to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity included a target that dealt with the prevention of extinctions, which is Target 12. So recapitulating about the work of the Convention, mainly in sustainable wildlife management, we can say that there are some primary areas of focus. Sustainable management of wildlife used for food or wild meat, also known as bushmeat, monitoring tools and databases, multidisciplinary approaches in sustainable wildlife management, including alternative livelihoods, subsistence use of wildlife, and wild meat and food security. So let's talk a little bit about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. As I mentioned before, this was recently adopted just last December. If any of you happened to be there and had the opportunity to assist to COP, you will remember that besides being very cold, there were super intense negotiations, and this actually followed a 4-year consultation and negotiation process. And this historic framework builds from the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020 and the 2080 targets that I just mentioned that were adopted in Nagoya during COP10. And really, what this is a global response for the loss of biodiversity and the threat that this poses to nature and human well-being. And concerning human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, I have to say that this is a paradigm shift because it's the first time that an international policy document, as far as I know, really includes it as a target. And we will talk about this just in a bit. So let me tell you a bit more about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's got 4 goals for 2050, 23 action targets for 2030, and alongside COP15 also decided on a comprehensive framework of planning, monitoring, reporting, reviewing, implementation, also to guarantee the necessary financial resources for the implementation, addresses also capacity development and technical and scientific cooperation, and alongside an agreement on digital sequence information and genetic resources. So in summary, the 4 goals refer to halting extinctions, the sustainable use of biodiversity, access and benefit sharing related to genetic resources, and something that is very important, that is addressing a funding gap for the implementation. Now, as previously mentioned, this is really a policy shift. And here, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes the issue of reducing threats to biodiversity by minimizing human-wildlife conflict of coexistence, and this can be found under Target 4 that works under reducing threats to biodiversity. Sorry, I forgot to pass the slide. It is also worth to mention that there are other targets that are also important to this topic. For example, Target 9 that refers directly to the management of wild species, to the sustainable management of wild species. And also, it's worth mentioning that even though not all targets refer directly to this topic, it's important to interpret the whole global biodiversity framework as a comprehensive solution. This means that targets cannot be interpreted on an isolated way, and each target depends on the other for its fulfillment. Therefore, I would also like to mention Target 22, that calls to ensure the full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation in decision-making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities. And also Target 23, that provides that implementation follows a gender-responsive approach. As I get close to the end of my presentation, I would like to highlight my previous comment as the Global Biodiversity Framework being a turning point on how human-wildlife conflicts are included in international instruments and how the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity and parties recognize this issue as one of the main challenges to be addressed when it comes to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And coming back to the anecdote that I shared with you at the beginning of this presentation, I was thinking, what if my friend would have asked me, so what does this actually mean for me, referring to the situation that I just passed? And I guess that the response that I would have shared with him is that we have a lot of work ahead. And really the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's a huge task. And as it was mentioned yesterday by the acting executive secretary on the video that was shared in the morning, we require a whole government and a whole society approach, and also political will and recognition of government and transformative action and cooperation by all levels of government and by all actors in society. I guess that for us, the big question now is, as CBD, how do we better support parties to achieve its targets? And I have to say that conferences such as this one are really valuable for us because it gathers experts, like all of you, from all places, all over the world, practitioners, governments, to engage in discussions, to discuss your work, to share ideas. And this is precisely what we need to move forward and to achieve all our objectives. So here I thank you for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Mariano, you might have to wait to take questions. Thank you, Mariano, for the lovely, informative talk, and maybe we can take 2 questions. There's a hand. Yeah, Mariano.
Thank you very much. Interesting talk, thank you. I just wondered, because I think on your first slide you said that the CBD was created in, I think, 1996, or thereabouts. So anyway, roughly 25, 30 years ago. I just wonder, given the disappointing results of the AICHI targets, has there been an evaluation of the outcomes and impact of the CBD's work?
Well, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, it was actually adopted in '93, and as you mentioned, precisely knowing how the AICHI targets, like how far these targets were achieved, it's part of the evaluation that was made. And I think that it's always helpful, even for self-reflection, not only for the convention, but for the parties, to really determine how much are we really advancing on this. And this is precisely what I mentioned, that we have, I mean, getting the Global Biodiversity Framework was a historic achievement, but we really have a lot of work ahead of us because now we have a really, really ambitious plan and targets to fulfill.
Yes, thank you so much. Could you please tell us something about the new fund to be established and housed at the Global Environment Facility? Are there any commitments, hard commitments to do this new fund? And when is it going to get started?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm afraid that I cannot answer it right now. The targets that I followed during the negotiations were not precisely those. I think that there was somebody from the Global Environmental Facility here, but yeah, I think that funding was secured for the achievement of the targets, as I mentioned in one of the slides.
Maybe we can take another question. We have some time.
Hi, Lisa Faraway from the Global Wildlife Program at the World Bank. Yesterday we presented a rapid assessment we did of MBSAPs, and we looked how many of them mentioned human-wildlife conflict. And we found that it was around 1/4 of all MBSAPs. And if you look at the regional breakdowns, around 40% of MBSAPs from countries in Africa. And that's without having human-wildlife conflict explicitly mentioned in any of the AICHI targets. So my question to you is, now that it is mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework, what opportunities do you think there are for human-wildlife conflict as countries update and revise their MBSAPs? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and I actually assisted to your panel yesterday. It was super interesting, and yeah, you had really amazing presentations. I guess that precisely the question you're making is the same thing that we're working on right now, right? Which is, how do we support parties to really develop and to really develop and achieve all these targets? And I guess that forums, just as this one, are the perfect scenarios to discuss what are the better ways to approach this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariano. Yeah.